Hello and welcome to the University of South Australia's Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence Annual Lecture for 2020. I'm Anthony Elliott, Dean of External Engagement at the University of South Australia, where I'm also Executive Director of the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. The annual lecture is the cornerstone of our events program each year, usually delivered at the University of South Australia's City West campus. This year, 2020, sees a different style of delivery, a digital delivery as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. The lecturer for this year's annual lecture is Robert J. Holton, the renowned sociologist, author of such important texts as Making Globalization and Global Finance, contributor to many learned journals, and a sociologist and social theorist who has significantly transformed the ways in which social scientists and sociologists have come to understand the interconnections between the economy and globalization. It's a huge pleasure for me personally to introduce Robert J. Holton in this lecture. Over a number of years, Bob Holton has been an absolutely central figure in advising myself and colleagues at the University of South Australia in our engagement with the European Union for the development of our program of research, educational outreach and public diplomacy at the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence, which is a centre funded in partnership by the European Union and the University of South Australia. I'm very grateful to the wonderful support that Bob Holton has provided to us over these years, and he continues to advise us well. Robert J. Holton is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Trinity College in Dublin, and he's Adjunct Professor at the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence at the University of South Australia. He's also a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. In this lecture, Professor Holton will examine in detail the extreme uncertainty which pervades our lives and our lives in these times today. The combination, the twinned forces of the digital revolution, underpinned by its rapid globalization, now conjoined to COVID-19, has extended the reach, depth, and consequences of uncertainty for our lives today. Professor Holton traces this out against an historical backdrop from the Second World War through to the momentum in the development of the European Union, right through to the multilateral global institutions with which we contend in the 21st century. The title of Professor Holton's lecture is Europe and the Challenges of Uncertainty in the Age of Pandemic and Digitalisation.
Well, I'm very honoured to be here today to deliver the annual lecture of the Hawke EU Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. We live in very interesting times, and the title of my lecture, Europe and the Challenges of Uncertainty in an Age of Digitalisation and Pandemic, that title is an indicator, I think, of some of the biggest issues and problems facing not only Europe but the world in general at the current time. I begin the lecture with a quote from Jean Monnet's memoirs. People only accept change when they are faced with necessity, and only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. The crises of his lifetime were really the two world wars and the Great Depression. These crises revealed that cooperation between nations was both necessary and possible if the key challenges were to be met. The recognition of this necessity led to the foundation of new institutions at both the global and European level. We now live in another world of crisis and challenge across multiple dimensions of human life. These include the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the most topical, but well before the pandemic, other profound challenges and crises have emerged. Climate change is obviously clearly of great importance here, but so are nationalistic challenges to a multilateral world order. Added to all these is the further challenges posed by digitalization, robotics, and artificial intelligence. My lecture today takes up Jean Monnet's argument about crisis and change. The key question then is how far will contemporary crises and challenges produce a similar recognition of the need for change, leading on to effective change itself. I'll start by considering how similar our situation is in 2020 to that facing Jean Monnet and Europe and the world in 1945. There are clearly similarities. Both points in time have disrupted normal life, government, civil society, the economy, disrupted by an intense and in many ways tragic battery of abnormal processes and events. In 1945, the geopolitical need to pool national sovereignty in order to find cooperative solutions to problems of warfare, economic collapse, and social injustice had a long prehistory, as well as facing an intensified period of challenge between 1914 and 1945. In 2022, we find that issues of pandemic, climate change, economic disruption due to digital technology all have aspects of a previous history. There have been earlier pandemics and epidemics, and they helped produce and sustain international cooperation. The challenge of climate change has also been around for decades, and technological change of a disruptive kind can be traced back at least to the Industrial Revolution, if not before. What is not clear in all of this is that crisis and challenge invariably creates recognition of the necessity for change and the momentum for change. Jean Monnet was well aware of that because the First World War ended in crisis, but the destruction and misery were not really effectively dealt with. Even though the League of Nations promised much, it achieved very little. Cooperation foundered very quickly in the interwar period, and the Depression made its chances even worse. So what obstructs the recognition of change and change itself? Well, failure to recognize the need for change may arise through problems of inadequate information and knowledge, but conflicts of interest are usually equally important. Conflicts of interest between regional, national, and global institutions have been prominent during the current pandemic. They are most evident in the conflict between China and the USA. Within the EU, cooperation and conflict again are evident. The vexed question of how to pay for the lockdown, which has engaged the EU and its members now for a while, has generated a range of options from mutualization of debt to the current plans by Germany and France to produce a mixture of grants and redistribution of resources. Now, the different priorities and interests don't necessarily mean we're headed for geopolitical warfare between the USA and China, and they don't necessarily presage the end of the EU. But it is the case, I think, that complex interplays between different interests do tend to inhibit consensus and undermine any momentum towards change and innovation. That sounds somewhat pessimistic, but I reach now for an interesting argument proposed by the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas, who argued for a normative approach to social evolution. The assumption he made was that we do not have the capacity not to learn. So learning is always possible. And if learning is also possible, crisis resolution or crises can be recognized and understood better, and we may be able to develop positive and practical ways of resolving them. But what inhibits us from learning more or learning slowly? What normative changes would be required in the world post-pandemic if we were to prevent a future disastrous impact of this kind? And do we need to learn to manage and confront the challenges of digitalization, robotics, and artificial intelligence? These are very important questions. But the major theme of this lecture really trying to tackle what is holding us back, what is inhibiting recognition of change, is uncertainty. And in particular, I'll talk a little bit about the notion of radical uncertainty. I believe this is the biggest challenge facing us at the moment. It faces us as citizens, it faces governments, it faces scientists and entrepreneurs. This is the most distinctive feature, I think, of this current crisis compared to what went before. Uncertainty isn't new. Pandemics like the Black Death or the economic disruptions of the two world wars did create bewilderment, confusion and worry, madness and a lack of confidence. But what is distinctive today, I think, is that uncertainty is now set within the context of the interaction of multiple problems, multiple areas of economic, social, political, cultural life are involved. The idea of radical uncertainty comes from two economists, John Kay and Mervyn King, who was governor of the Bank of England. And I think that this notion captures the position very well. In 1945, Jean Monnet and those dealing with the aftermath of war faced some uncertainties. They weren't sure if the economy would collapse. But in 1945, peace was achieved, and a new confidence, certainly among the victorious powers, there was a confidence that institutions could be reshaped and problems could be solved. The uncertainty of war was replaced by a new politics of hope and social reconstruction to create progress beyond death and destruction. This wasn't an epoch, I would say, of radical uncertainty. It's the time when the United Nations was established, the World Bank, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, and together with the planning that saw the origins of the EU. This epoch also saw technological progress, including antibiotics and new technologies in aviation, which appeared largely progressive. While Cold War conflicts soon emerged and cast a long shadow, nonetheless, I think the period in which Monnet was so productive was one with a far higher degree of confidence and hope than the one we currently face, where I think multiple radical uncertainties are undermining hope. So I think they're truly unprecedented in modern times, are far more profound than the uncertainties of financial crises by themselves. So I want to look at this theme of uncertainty and crisis, first of all via the pandemic, and then in relation to digital technology. Pandemic and the economy obviously closely intertwined, and there's a dilemma underneath here which makes politics very problematic. This dilemma weighs in the balance the costs and benefits of lockdown to prevent deaths as against economic restart to prevent mass destitution. If we had perfect information about the dynamics and evolution of the virus and perfect information about the costs and benefits of different lockdown and restart strategies, public policies could be far better designed and public confidence would be far greater than it currently is. Rational politicians in this idealized world of perfect information would be able to avoid much of the current political malaise of vague promises, confusing roadmaps, and lack of transparency. Right, so I've tried to break down the idea of uncertainty in three dimensions, what I've called epistemic, policy, and social. Epistemology is really the study of knowledge. How do we get knowledge? How reliable is it? How much can we say we really know? The science involved in the pandemic is still very uncertain, both as to the long-term trajectory of the virus and issues of antibodies and immunity. Will it be like the other pandemics or not? The best result for a vaccine to deal with a virus, I understand, is mumps, which took 4 years. So a new vaccine, effective vaccine, might take anything from 4 years to infinity. Some uncertainties here may be short-term, and certainly science has the capacity to learn. And there is an impressive globalization of some aspects of scientific research going on at the moment, even in spite of the international conflicts. But there's no guarantee any of them will work. And we have epistemic uncertainties to do with business as well, which I'll talk about a little later. Policy uncertainty, well, if knowledge is very limited and imperfect, it makes it very unclear what to do. This is true in terms of both short-term public health responses and the articulation of health policy with economic policy. The EU faces difficulties because public health responses are nationally determined, while economic support during the lockdown is divided between institutions like the European Central Bank, the Stability Mechanism, and ad hoc negotiations between nations, as in the Germany-France initiatives. But whereas the ECB is organized to be able to respond quickly, other areas of policy making and implementation are less able to act quickly. And as we know, consensus between 27 nations is very difficult. But uncertainty in policy also affects how we deal with the future. What do we plan for? Such planning as there was for this pandemic assumed that the future pandemics would be flu-like rather than coronavirus. That was wrong. But there are also failures of coordination, of innovation. Unlike the USA, the EU has not developed a similar public agency to the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Agency. This body helps businesses develop treatments against possible future pandemics and emerging diseases. The third element social uncertainty. Epistemology is hard enough. Even measuring things that can be counted, that can be quantified, has its problems. You can try to measure citizens' opinions in polls, but what is hardest to determine, the effects of the pandemic on social morale, which is very hard to get at. Suicide, mental health data, domestic violence give some sorts of indications of stresses, but broad indications on social community social morale is very, very hard. One area worth looking at, though, is social media. I would argue that this shows how digital networks of families, households, friends, co-workers, co-religionists, affinity groups, and celebrities and their followers have indeed expanded in scope and are a kind of social capital that is a resource at a time when government support is confused, too slow, and misdirected. And social capital, I think, has done better than finance capital. The epistemological problems of knowing what to invest in are extremely difficult, because if you don't know what is going to happen, how can you value any particular asset? Many simply await the return to business as usual, but I think that's very short-sighted. And social issues seem to me to be relevant to what is a missing element in pandemic policy, a missing explicit element, and that is planning for social equity. We know that the poor, the unemployed, the elderly are far more vulnerable to death than the population in general. We also know that the young, the elderly, and often women are more vulnerable to losing jobs. And we know some sectors gain support and others do not. This, I think, is very worrying. Amartya Sen, the Indian Nobel laureate, with a long experience of researching Indian famine, argued if you don't include social equity considerations within pandemic planning and in wider social and economic crises, then you're going to simply repeat all the processes of neglect and social collapse from the past. If we want to address these mistakes, we have to think more clearly about what should be done. I'll give you one example. One of the most significant areas of neglect in social equity policy has been the complete lack in most countries of any attempt to address the vulnerability of those in aged care homes. And the impact of that is extraordinary, but some countries don't even measure that in their death rates. That is really irresponsible. Now I want to come on to digitalization, artificial intelligence. And I want to address that in relation to a question of what will post-COVID society look like. For those who've been made unemployed, how and when will they find work? Will some entire sectors like the arts collapse? How will they be revived? And how well will social morale generally revive? Now, three trends. There's much speculation about this. Three typical trends that are mentioned are less globalization, by which people mean less free trade, more economic protectionism, one might say there's actually more globalization in the area of technological sharing and in the area of scientific collaboration. More public debt to pay for it, but also increased digitalization, and that's the trend I want to concentrate on. Digitalization and artificial intelligence. Well, this has been around for a while, but if it's to be the centerpiece of the revival of the post-COVID society, or at least one of the major points of momentum, we need to know, will it create or destroy jobs? Will it stabilize social life or disrupt it? Within the EU, the Commission has certainly come to see digitalization as an increasingly important part of industrial policy alongside decarbonisation. And in general, much effort has been aimed at creating new digital skills so people are equipped. But there are some problems here. One of the biggest problems is the assumption that digitalization and artificial intelligence are simply positive and progressive, socially neutral technologies, and that they're inevitable. So that's quite a lot of problems, or problematic assumptions, I would say. One of the reasons is because it glosses over the social consequences of new technology, which in turn feeds panic and anxiety about employment loss. But it's not clear what the employment consequences will be. Research I've conducted with Ross Boyd here at the University of South Australia suggests that the most extreme estimations of unemployment created by the new technology are not sustained either by evidence today or parallels from history. New technologies typically destroy jobs but create or help to create others. In addition, machine intelligence often fails to meet the hopes that investors hold for them. The public debate is typically dominated by those that are selling it, who obviously have an interest in projecting its confident and widespread and progressive impact. But are they right? Machines still cannot perform many kinds of tasks that humans currently perform, including those that involve creativity, face-to-face communication, and non-standardized decision-making. So we come back to a kind of epistemic problem here. If we don't really know how far this technology is going to work, and if we don't know where the jobs are, how can we more precisely target digital skill formation? What kinds of digital skills will be most in demand? I mean, who could doubt the idea it is a very important policy area to increase digital skills, but of what kind and where? And how do you combine those skills with social skills around communication and the development of creativity and creative problem solving? And social equity planning, you can see how all these areas interact. Social equity planning in this area would need to take into account the life course. Many of those who will lose jobs will be probably middle-aged, unskilled or semi-skilled workers, made unemployed. Now, are they going to get retrained? And retrained as what? What skills? Again, this is very unclear. But there are wider problems with digital technology involving governance. We know already that it is being applied in health through digital monitoring devices, in consumption activities through the digital platforms that track our expenditure, and through political and leisure activities, through GPS devices knowing where you are, and facial recognition technology knowing who is there and who is there even in political protests and moving across boundaries of various kinds. There are huge problems of personal privacy, human rights, and the integrity of democracy here. If control of digital technologies involving these intrusive processes is not transparent to personal and public accountability, then democracy itself is weakened. So there's some, obviously there is wide recognition of this. The EU has tried to recognize power inequalities in which digital technologies are organized in large corporations, largely through tax policy. Issues of control of data generated are important too, but progress in that in Europe's been delayed by the pandemic. And so one set of challenges here can inhibit the other, even before we come down to the economic interests that don't want to be taxed digitally, and those sorts of questions. The way in which interacting crises can inhibit momentum for change is something I think which is not in Jean Monnet's formula, and it's something we should think more about. The French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, he argued that digital capitalism linked with machine calculation is conducted at such a superhuman speed that it's disrupting human capacities, such as desire, affection, attachment, identification, singularity, and the very feeling of existing. Human beings, in other words, lose their cultural bearings and creativity in the process. A countercultural alternative is required if social morale is not to be undermined. Speed, however, is also a feature of the challenges of the pandemic. The virus crosses borders with alacrity in a world of personal mobility. Policymakers need to make responses that are similarly rapid. But just as digital capitalism foreshortens timeframes in a way that outruns questioning of the algorithmic assumptions on which they're based, so viral virulence and mobility outruns the knowledge base on which policy making should ideally proceed. The dilemma of how to take effective action in a rapidly changing environment is very hard to resolve. So my conclusion in this particular section is digitalization is not a socially neutral and necessarily progressive force. Its further development relies on corporate and government support, and there are powerful economic interests and political choices to be made. The hubris of entrepreneurs who make enormous promises about the benefits of new technologies are also a problematic part of the picture. And as I've already said, there is a largely unseen graveyard of failed robots and unsuccessful applications of artificial intelligence that cost millions or billions and turned out not to work. Technology doesn't by itself drive change. The economic, political, social context matter too. For change to be socially responsible, technology requires social and cultural legitimacy too. Given these preconditions, new technologies could be progressive and have positive social implications. Without them, democracy is extremely vulnerable, and hence this project is a very problematic aspect of the future, the immediate future. Well, I'll try to wrap up now, coming back to Monnet's formula, people will only accept change when they are faced with necessity and only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. Well, I think it's insufficient. Crises do not necessarily engender momentum for change. I'm struck by the reassertion of conservatism and tradition. Uncertainty and radical uncertainty create fear. They create a reliance on what we know and what we know from the past. So there is an extraordinary element of fear, and politicians, faced with all these with all the dilemmas I've indicated, which are not the fault of politicians, but politicians tend to use traditional and conservative narratives about nation and about our normal ways of doing things to emphasize getting back to business as usual. And that conservative reaction, I think, undermines or tends to undermine recognition of the need for change. I think elite consensus and cohesion is also a significant element here. In 1945, the political elites, at least within the victorious powers, were united in pursuit of institutional reform of governance with mass support from populations. There was a lot of hope. Reform might take might be different in different countries, but the general need for change was recognized. It seems to me in 2020, political elites in Europe and elsewhere are far more divided. Geopolitical conflicts are unresolved, and populations feel vulnerable and challenged by radical uncertainty. So there again, that is a significant element. Something else missing, I think, is vision. As we need practical policies, but we need vision. Neither neoliberalism, let's just get back to the market economy and the revival of current economic institutions, neither that nor muscular nationalism, if I can call it that, provide, I think, a vision. They're both, in a sense, conservative. They're both, in a sense, steeped in the status quo. There's more of a sense of vision, I think, around the environment and climate change. But in a way, that is parked there alongside many of these other forces of conservatism and the backward-looking emphasis that I've spoken of. So my overall conclusion on Monnet is major crises and challenges don't necessarily produce a momentum towards recognition of change or actual change itself. What is required, I think, is a sense of wider legitimation, a sense of vision, and probably a degree of elite coherence and consensus as to what to do. So, if you like, Monnet is a good start, but for the future we need Monnet Plus. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ross Boyd. I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Hawke EU Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence, and I would like to thank Professor Holton for his both topical and intellectually stimulating lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
There are a few questions that we would like to ask, very, very brief ones, if I may.
Please.
The first, one thing you didn't discuss that much is the issue of trust. To what extent is trust a key factor behind what we are witnessing as sometimes effective and sometimes ineffective responses to the challenges, and particularly the pandemic today?
Thank you. It's a good question. You could say that trust is a limiting case to uncertainty. That is to say, if there is personal or collective trust in something, then that is going to be combined with hope, with confidence, and with perhaps more practical levels of response. I didn't talk about trust, partly because I was advancing an argument about radical uncertainty, and one of the missing elements in radical uncertainty is indeed trust. So you're right, it is part of the picture. Now, it wouldn't be true to say I don't think that trust has completely gone, because we're not living a completely dog-eat-dog brutal world. There are some very brutal places in the world, racked usually by civil war and authoritarian government, and you wouldn't expect issues of trust really to be particularly prominent there, except perhaps amongst people who want to resist. But in our situation, in more pacified parts of the world, trust is not absent. What I would see is that it's been somewhat in the retreat during the pandemic in particular. And I do think that politicians are in a very difficult situation in terms of conventional ways of talking and doing politics, because those presume that you, broadly speaking, you know what you're doing, that you've got a grip on things, and you're capable of producing some sense of relevant policy. Now, we might differ depending on our party political views or ideology as to which of those should be adopted, but one way or the other, there is this assumption that people know what they're doing. But once that gets challenged, once that, I mean, in a acute form, there's simply the charge, you're lying, if you don't like what the politician's saying. But there's a broader problem in that, I think, which is lack of trust, that if, when a question is asked, typically politicians don't answer the question, and that's been going on a long time, but if, when the urgency of pandemic, when the urgency of a lot of the uncertain changes are there, it becomes far more problematic when politicians don't answer the question. On the other hand, if people are not acquainted in their education with epistemology, and I'm going to run what you might think is a completely utopian argument here, but if you train people digital skills, but you don't give them any sense of what are the strengths and limits of the kinds of knowledge that digital skills can give, then you create a situation where when things don't work, people don't trust the technology or trust the science, rightly or wrongly. So at the moment we have very low trust in politicians, probably worse than real estate agents, but there's a lot of distrust of science and medicine. So we're in this epoch with anti-vaxxers, and with quite extraordinarily virulent attacks when medical science changes its mind about something. Now, I think for a lot of people who you just assume they know what they're doing. Professionals, politicians, entrepreneurs might not like it, but at least they're doing it because they've got a plan. But what if everything is hidden behind a veil of evasion and lack of transparency? Then trust is very hard. Now, there may be counterexamples to this. And certainly some social policies are more effective than others. Some pandemic response policies are more effective than others. But where they don't work, then trust is undermined. And I would say when they do work, it's generally because more thought has been given to the policies may be more well informed by the strengths and limits of the science, and maybe they're also in some cases easier to implement. In discussion we were talking about New Zealand's success in dealing with the pandemic. I would think in a way because of the Christchurch massacre, which is such a terrible and tragic thing, and because of periodic earthquakes, I think there's something particular about New Zealand, which means they've learnt to be very resilient even in the worst crisis, and I suspect that that resilience has helped trust, because people recognized what those previous problems are, and did all they could to deliver that. I think maybe that's helped in the present situation. So there's probably a historical element to trust. It isn't just a one-off thing that's one day you have it, the next day you don't. So that's one kind of way of addressing that.
Just one further question. In Monnet's time, there seemed to be a lot more confidence in the efficacy of public planning, of social planning. That has, for a range of reasons, seems to have been depleted between that Monnet's time and our time. To what extent has that fed into the radical uncertainty of which you've spoken of today?
Yeah, I think that's important. I do think that confidence in public planning goes in phases, and there are periods in history where that confidence is greater and periods when that is undermined. Monnet's memoirs, if you read them in detail, are precisely dealing with questions of how they came to realize, starting with the First World War and then through the Depression and the Second World War, that it was possible to plan, because they'd had to plan. In war you have to plan enormous amounts of resources, generally armaments, but you also have to plan for response to military warfare, to bombing, particularly in the Second World War. And in a way, in 1914, it's hard to make a generalization, but the period from the middle of the 19th century to the First World War was a kind of upswing in a global economy, like we've just had, and a sense that business and technology are the big momentum forces. Then when it comes to World War and then the Depression and then another World War, that kind of confidence changed. 1930s, Roosevelt, the New Deal, was a tremendous shift from previous laissez-faire economics in America. The Tennessee Valley Authority is an amazing case of infrastructural public planning under Roosevelt. And then you get another war. So it's that you can do it, you need to do it, and we can do it, and we can survive and come out the other end. So 1945, you've had Bretton Woods and they're creating new global economic institutions. There's one or two precedents, but not many. And then other countries develop. I mean, Britain develops the welfare state, the National Health Service, and these things are really, this confidence in planning is very great. And I think the labour movement, which in this period was much stronger than it is now, whereas a lot of the labour movement in the First World War was very unsure about increasing government control over people's lives. By the Second World War, it was, we're all fighting this war, and in return, we're going to have a better world afterwards because we've put in. And so my sense is, you're right, planning around the Monnet period is much more fundamental. And by the 70s, 80s, by Reagan, Thatcher, we get the sense that the huge problems of the past having been largely resolved, or many of them, not social equity, but a lot of the other things, destruction of war, lack of cooperation, those things are beginning to be addressed. And so you get this return of not just free trade, but deregulation, let the economy rip. Economy and technology will solve everything. So that's now we're now getting to the point where we have to ask again, and indeed many people are saying this, that's gone too far, and we need to somehow regain a momentum for a more sort of socially, economically interventionist policy, but without repeating the bureaucratic mistakes of the past. Now, in a sense, the EU, there's always been this question, does it look more to Boston or Berlin? Does it look more to the liberal economic model, or does it look more to social Europe? And it's, each side critiques the other for the influence they have on the EU. But the EU maintained a commitment to planning, and planning in areas like addressing regional inequality, shifting of public funds to bring up the poorer parts of Europe closer to the wealthier parts. That's been relatively successful. I worked in Ireland for a number of years, very important in Ireland. No wonder the Irish want to stay in the EU. And there are many other examples of that. But planning, the old dichotomy between individualism and planning, freedom and control, by itself, that's far too crude. It isn't. There are no answers there. That's an ideological divide. Who wants to be involved in that sort of thing? What if you need planning? You need sensible planning. Not sure I'd use the word light touch, but I'd use the word effective. And it may be when we come out further from pandemic, it's hard to tell now, we'll be better able to identify in the pandemic the areas where public policy worked, or worked reasonably well, the areas where it didn't. And I think that's also true with new technology. I'll give you one example where new technology can make a difference. One of the most vulnerable groups of workers around the globe during the pandemic is those who work in abattoirs, meat packing, which is the euphemism. And whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the US, whether it's in the state of Victoria, there are significant concentrations of COVID cases. This is largely because of the work conditions where people work at a very fast pace on assembly lines in huge operations where space is at a premium, so people work very close together. So these are, again, giant petri dishes for infection. Never mind cruise ships. And that's a major problem. One exception. Where is the exception? Denmark. Why Denmark? I mean, Denmark is a huge pork producer. Well, why Denmark? Because they use robotics to a considerable degree in abattoirs. So there's less concentration of people. So there's a case where, but that's more highly capital intensive, and rather than using the model of massed together cheap labor, doing simple repetitive tasks on an assembly line. So that would be a case where, and I read this yesterday in the London Financial Times, we're starting to get a trickle of stories like this, where you've got evidence about what's working and what isn't working. So I think these are very good questions, but I think even in another 3 months, we'll be able to do a much better evaluation as more of these case studies come together. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.